Pregnancies, by their technical and medical meaning, are parasitic.
And so when does a child enter the rights framework, or when should it enter the rights framework?
And the US Constitution makes you a person and a citizen at birth. You don't become a citizen in the womb.
Most arguments about family planning and abortion start in the wrong place. They begin with law, they begin with politics, often they begin with morality. Professor Michele Goodwin begins somewhere more important and maybe sometimes more uncomfortable, with power. Who gets watched, who gets believed, who gets punished, and what happens when some of the most intimate decisions that a person can make become matters for courts, for prosecutors, hospitals, the state, and even the media. I'm Dominic Bowen, and I'm host of the International Risk Podcast. And today we're speaking with Professor Michele Goodwin of Georgetown Law about reproductive politics, about public health, democracy, and the risks that really matter. Professor Goodwin, welcome to the International Risk Podcast.
It is a pleasure to be with you. Thank you so much for having me.
And whereabouts do we find you today?
You find me in Washington, D.C., very close to the White House, to the Capitol building and our federal infrastructure.
Fantastic. I feel like it would be remiss of me not to ask: is the famous pool reflecting blue or green today?
I have not been by the pool, so I'm not sure. I would be very doubtful that it's reflecting blue. We do have quite a bit of haze that is left over from the fireworks, the very intense fireworks that were displayed actually the morning of July 5th and not the evening of July 4th.
Interesting. Very, very interesting. I mean, we could have a whole podcast about the 250th celebration, but we might leave that to another podcast.
We could. We can leave that to another one, though we could. There would be lots to say.
There would be lots for sure. I mean, look, this is a really, I mean, it is a very serious and it's a very important topic. And when we talk about healthcare and bioethics and reproductive rights and civil liberties, I think the debate and the discussion around it often starts too late. You know, we talk about different court rulings, we discuss political positions, and it's often really at a crisis once it comes to that point. You and I were talking just before we started recording. I've been in rooms where, you know, there's been hundreds of people crying about funding decisions and political decisions. And, you know, I think that's really often, it really is too late. But before we talk about the law and the policy, I think we need to talk about human dignity, about bodily autonomy, medical trust, and the limits of where state authority should go. So, where do you think the conversation should start?
That's right. Well, I think the conversation should start with human dignity, that which we have, which is inalienable, that can't be taken away by government, that cannot be governed by religious position, that is as fundamental as we understand our right, our liberty, the nature of being able to breathe, to be able to drink water, what is fundamental to the being. And we have become so divorced from that in political parlance and political decision making. And we are extreme in that regard with regard to women and people with uteruses, and not so much with men. And so it's a vast difference between how we understand a man's body and the ability to be able to navigate intimate spaces, political spaces, local spaces. There is a default in understanding the dignity, the autonomy, the freedom, the liberty of a male body. And we've not reached that point with regard to a girl's body, to a woman's body. It is something that becomes politicized, in spaces criminalized, policed, surveilled, shackled, and so much more. And we'll unpack all of those different iterances and inferences.
Yeah, definitely. And I think some listeners would potentially be rolling their eyes and going, "Oh, listen to that rhetoric." But I think it's really important that we'll unpack where do those words come from, and what does that mean?
Yes, let's unpack that, because the quick default for people could be, oh, I've heard this before. There's no mystery here. There's important reasons why the state steps in. And so let's unpack what makes that actually problematic. Let's be nuanced in terms of how we understand the way in which state and civil society has governed the space of reproduction.
Yeah, no, I think that's important, and I wonder if you can help me, and maybe some of our listeners as well. One of the hardest parts of this debate, when people ask me my opinion, when one of the bits I really struggle with on this is that if we can very simply say both sides, and I know there's more than just two sides, but if we say the two sides of this debate, they both speak about rights. One talks about the rights of the unborn child and the unborn child's right to life, while the other side frames it around bodily autonomy, equality and privacy and health and freedom of state coercion and their own human rights. How should policy make? And I think both of those, and that's a bit I struggle with because I go, yeah, definitely the unborn child has a right to life. And not but, and of course, and so does the woman. And that's where I sort of sit now, I look at both sides and I go, they're both talking at each other, but never together and never moving it forward. So, how should policymakers and courts and citizens of both genders, and certainly we know that there's a huge uh, uh, leaning toward there is more men in many of these decision making roles that don't necessarily have to make these same decisions. How should they be thinking about this?
So let's start with origins. That's really important. And you're right that the vast majority of people who make decisions in these spaces with regard to reproductive health care happens to be men. From a historical point of view in the United States, just to take one page from that, that too became politicized. In the US, nearly 100% of reproductive health care had actually been governed by women leading up to the time of the US Civil War. That changes near the time of the US Civil War, and the change is dramatic. Those women were midwives and they governed health care. And when you think about it, that's not strange, right? If you think about for millennia, human beings have been on the planet. Were there men walking around in white lab coats and stethoscopes telling women, open your legs, let me peer inside? No. But we've been so divorced from the reality of who we are as human beings. Were there men governing women's body? No. For millennia, there were not. There were not men that say, okay, bend over now and let's do this. That was knowledge that was held by women. And there were very specific political and medical platforms to push women out of healthcare. The American Medical Association has in recent years apologized for its role in that, in its effort to push women out and to push, in particular, women of color out, because in the United States, more than half of the midwives were actually Black women who had been enslaved or formerly enslaved that were doing reproductive health care. And again, not a mystery if we just sit back and think about it. But nearing the time of the Civil War, it became a time in which those who were committed to the platforms of slavery became really concerned about what we call today and what was called then replacement theory. And this idea was that if the abolitionists achieved their goals, and here we're talking about white abolitionists who were men who were in Congress, and we could spend a lot of time talking about them, and they deserve to be talked about because these were people who were recognizing the ills of American slavery, and in particular, recognizing the sexual abuse, sexual assault on which it was based. Let me just take one pause here for anybody who might contest that. Uh, Thomas Jefferson, a revered American political figure, president, statesperson, wrote in letters, and you can find this on the website at Monticello, his famous plantation, which still offers tours and whatnot. And he wrote that it was better to stock your plantation with girls and women because they turned a profit every year or two. Now, Thomas Jefferson is not talking about they're just better than men and boys with picking tobacco. Thomas Jefferson is specifically talking about sexual exploitation. They're turning profit because they are breeding and bearing new babies which can be bought, sold, traded. This is what he's talking about. So, at the time in which the march towards the Civil War is going to happen because the abolitionists in Congress are finding it difficult to grapple with the fact that they're reading advertisements daily. Gang of breeding wenches, 8 to 10 years old, 10 to 12 years old for sale. What does that mean? What makes you a breeding wench? And why is this 8-year-old being sold as a breeding wench? And this being normalized, this is not hidden in some private, sneaky, shaky kind of publication. These are the learned papers of the time where you read policy decisions, but you're also reading about the depravities of slavery that became normalized. So, as the march towards the end of this is happening, as there are what were called the radical Republicans in Congress in the United States who are saying we can't stand for this, and their number one plea against slavery was on sexual assault and forced reproduction. It was the most compelling argument that they could make, and they were making it. Just days before, a senator from Massachusetts, Charles Sumner, was nearly beaten to death by a colleague in Congress. He was nearly killed in Congress because he had just given a speech called Rape and was specifically on this point. So when we get to the end of midwifery, it is because there are political figures, there are doctors who are saying that they need white women in this crusade and that they need white women to, quote, spread their loins north, east, south, and west. Before this time, abortion was not criminalized. Abortion was legal in the United States. The Pilgrims performed abortion. It was, nobody's business. In fact, Benjamin Franklin wrote a pamphlet about how to perform an abortion. Thomas Jefferson and some other leading figures at the time had made commentary about these are just private issues. These begin to lose that shape when the question of the shape of American democracy becomes a question. Can slavery prevail? If slavery isn't going to prevail, how do you make sure that white people have enough numbers to be able to keep the United States in much of the fashion that it had been before? So this becomes a political issue. So where do we begin? We have to understand these histories. And then we have to understand the body itself. We've become divorced from that in the political crusade here. The pregnancies, by their technical and medical meaning, are parasitic. The human body tries to avoid pregnancy. It does. That's menstruation, which starts early. It's the effort to try to push out any form of a pregnancy and early. How does a pregnancy happen? And I think this is actually important. I apologize to your listeners who already know this, but given that our US Supreme Court has gotten this wrong, it's worth noting. A pregnancy it happens when there is an ova and sperm meets that ova, but just a sperm meeting an ova floating around in a uterus is not a pregnancy. Technically, medically, that's really important because there are those that say, well, pregnancy, unborn childhood begins at the point in which a semen enters the uterus. No, not at all. It's not. That semen has to match the ova and then it implants in the uterine wall. But even that does not sustain a pregnancy because more than 20 to 30% of what is a pregnancy will end in miscarriage, oftentimes without a person ever knowing it because it just looks like menstruation. Stillbirth, because now the pregnancy is gone for a bit of time, but the body releases it. The question, historically, going back millennia and even to the present, why does the body do that? Well, it turns out pregnancies are very dangerous. What makes this difficult for us is that I have a child. Many of your listeners have children. We love our children. We absolutely do. And so our love for our children can sometimes mask and confuse us about what biologically happens to be true and medically happens to be true, which is that the body tries to push away, avoid pregnancy. Why? Because it's dangerous. And let me just say that I'm speaking to you from the United States Capitol. We have the highest rate of maternal mortality,
Mhm.
the highest rate of maternal morbidity amongst our peer nations, the highest rates of infant mortality, and also infant morbidity. So even though there is a romanticization of what pregnancy means, it's very romantic. Ooh, childbirth. It turns out it can be very fraught, incredibly dangerous. And that doesn't matter which side. And one of the things that we've begun to see in the United States post the Supreme Court's overturning of Roe v. Wade, which decriminalized abortion, what we've begun to see is that by very high percentages and numbers, women who identified themselves previously as being anti abortion coming forward and saying that they experienced a medical crisis and almost lost their lives. and they needed the medical technology to help them save their lives while they were experiencing that medical miscarriage, which could have killed them. And we have seen post Dobbs women who have actually died, women bleeding out in their cars. People are coming to understand that this is a medical, that this is health, body, medicine. It's not politics.
Wow, thank you very much. So much in there, so much in there. I want to dive into, and I appreciate you explaining some of the history, which some of that's certainly new to me and no doubt our listeners. But also things that I think, and I've heard that or some of those statistics before. That not only is pregnancy in the US beautiful and romantic, it is also very very dangerous, which is hard to imagine for what we largely consider to be the world's best country, the world's most advanced country. If we look at today and what's happening today in America, and in your book you talk about the book "Policing the Womb" and Invisible Women and the Criminalization of Motherhood, and you use some of the language earlier on, and I think that's really powerful. But in your book, you talk about how reproductive control is not just about abortion access; it's also about the surveillance that occurs, and sometimes the punishment, the links to poverty, the links to race, which you've alluded to, but also the criminal justice system, which I think many of us would go, hold on, healthcare, criminal justice system, where's the link there? Talk to us about the criminalization of pregnancy and motherhood. Talk to us about state control and what are the things that many of us have just never considered?
It's a great question. Thank you so much for referencing my book, Policing the Womb: Invisible Women and the Criminalization of Motherhood. And let me share there, that was a book that I anticipated. All right, 2 years, I'll write the book and I'll get it out and move on to the next project. That book was 10 years in the making. And not 10 years because I just couldn't get the words out. I was publishing articles along the way, but I was spending time in Alabama. I was going to Texas. I was going to these places all across the world. I was speaking with prosecutors. I was speaking multiple times with prosecutors who were telling me about how they targeted women who were pregnant, how they visited hospitals, how they uh, spoke with nurses and doctors, asking them to call when they had a pregnancy, when a patient came in with a pregnancy and that patient revealed information which should only have been
Mhm.
contained to the nurse and the doctor. But when the nurse and the doctor suspected that this would be something that could violate local law, and I'll give you an example, and they were told, called prosecutors, and prosecutors began prosecuting pregnant women. Example could be a woman comes in for a prenatal visit and says, I had a very challenging time in the last couple of weeks and I took half of a Valium that wasn't mine. All right, that was the kind of thing that could trigger a call to local law enforcement and prosecutors who would then prosecute those women. So, what began to take shape in the United States is that during its 1980s, 90s drug war, so-called drug war, it began targeting uh, women, particularly Black women. And the target at the time in which Roe v. Wade was the law of the land. So these are women who are pregnant. And by the fact that they're going in for prenatal visits means that they are trying to do their best and
Mhm.
preserve their pregnancies. They
Mhm.
very well could have had abortions. They very well could have avoided medical appointments. But these were women who were showing up, who were trying to do their best to keep the healthiest pregnancy possible. What they didn't realize is that across the country, there were efforts being made that specifically targeted Black women. In fact, there were studies at the time that showed that a Black woman was 10 times more likely to have law enforcement called on her than her white counterpart for the exact same acknowledgement. I used this drug or this alcohol during pregnancy. And police would be called and these women would be prosecuted. I reported women being dragged out of hospitals in bloodied gowns, shackled and chained right after giving birth, women being shackled during birth, women giving birth in prison and on concrete floors and prison toilets, right? How in the world can we say that that's the dignified approach if our commitment is to babies that are born?
Mhm.
I contest the terminology of unborn child. That's something that has become infused
Mhm.
in legal discourse in recent years. It's not something that existed beyond recent years. But how can we say that we care for the dignity of children or dignity of a pregnancy when we know and say that the result will be that you're born into a condition where your mother is shackled and chained to a bed, when you are born in a prison toilet, when you're born on a concrete prison floor? Is that dignity to the child? Right? If we say like that's like the sole concern, well, how could we argue that that is anything dignified? And so that really began this process. And I think that one of the challenges that we must face is that there are those who care about reproductive freedom, justice, etc., who ignored those women. Right. So the racism that comes in from this is not just those who are anti abortion that were targeting Black women. It is true that Black women became scapegoats, canaries in the coal mine. Here is, one additional way where if you're thinking about 1,000 strikes towards reducing women's rights and freedoms, okay, we can start here. This is an easy cohort. They are poor. They're seeking public medical assistance. If they were seeking private medical assistance, perhaps their doctors would not be calling law enforcement. But they were the canaries in the coal mine, and they were ignored by reproductive rights organizations largely, who didn't see these women as being part of the cohort that they were concerned about. Those organizations were concerned about middle class white women largely being able to get birth control, terminate a pregnancy if they want to. They too demonize these women. They too said, well, you don't represent what our mission is. You're using drugs during your pregnancy. There's something wrong with you. But yet, what was taking place against those women was, in fact, this kind of policing of the womb. And it was also curating a personhood in fetuses, which, of course, now is the chief rallying cry of those who are against abortion.
And so when does a child enter the rights framework, or when should it enter the rights framework? I mean, I really struggle with that. You talked about at the point of conception. Is it at 6 weeks once there's a heartbeat? Is it at 22 weeks to 24 weeks when the life is viable? Is it once it's born? Like how do we pull that apart? I'm a Christian. I love the and have so much admiration for the love that Jesus had for people who were sinners, people who were making mistakes, people who were struggling in life.
Sure.
And so I really struggle to find out, even where do I sit on that? And I've had this conversation with so many women about what does it mean to you, and it's really difficult. So, from your perspective, where how should we recognize the child?
So let's be clear that there are different windows that we could look at. So, one window that one could peer through is one that is one rooted in a religious belief that at the time of sex, there are some that say at the time of sex, at that point onward, anything that develops must be protected. Now, one's religious views don't necessarily map onto what are legal views, and don't necessarily map on to what is actually accurate all the time, right? And so we must understand that, give respect towards people's religious viewpoints, but religious viewpoints do not govern how we live our lives and don't necessarily govern what is medically true. For example, I've described what a pregnancy is. For some, they believe that as long as there's sperm and ova together, that is a child. But that is, it's not a child, and it's not even a pregnancy, technically, uh, right? So, how do we then add greater nuance to this? Well, in Roe v. Wade, they had a trimester framework, and that trimester framework was something that came in some ways out of the air of Roe, and ultimately it would mean that Roe would become vulnerable to this trimester framework. The idea was that there's going to be a certain point of viability. Well, that clock of viability is a very interesting one. As medical technologies advance, then that means that the potential for viability becomes earlier and earlier. Neonatal wards are the most profitable of American hospitals now. That is where there is so much technology that is being invested. And largely, this has had less to do with questions of abortion and more assisted reproductive technologies, where there are individuals who now heighten the possibilities of what are called multiple order pregnancies or birth. But notice that viability is still at a time in which that developing fetus is still in the womb. We only know viability after birth. Were you viable? You have to be born to be viable. There are stillbirths that take place days before a pregnancy was due for delivery. That means that while gestational age we believe was viable, it turns out it actually wasn't viable, right? And that too is a matter of nuance. Old enough, but we only know viability after delivery is when we can confirm viability. And the final is with regard to law. And this is very interesting, right? So the US Constitution, in its 14th Amendment, we just had a big Supreme Court case about this birthright citizenship. And the US Constitution makes you a person and a citizen at birth. At birth, you become a citizen. You don't become a citizen in the womb. And when you think about it, Donald Trump, who has been very vocal about matters of immigration and also abortion, would not seek to say that there is personhood in a fetus when it comes to immigration matters. Just imagine all of the women who are in the United States that he otherwise would like to see out of the United States because they are not citizens, would not want for their pregnancies to be considered citizens, persons. We now have those persons, right? And so you see inconsistency. On one hand, anti abortion, unborn children. Okay, well, are the people who are pregnant in the United States right now who don't have green cards and who are not citizens, are all of those pregnancies now we can count those as births? We can count those as children? Can we count those? And the answer would be like, no, we can't count those. Right? And another piece of law that I think is important in terms of understanding the political nature of this is that the only time in law, and this is very recent, that we're thinking about uh, personhood in the uterus relates to questions about women's power and ability, relate to abortion. Otherwise, we are not raising those same questions, let's say, with trust in estates. Could your fetus buy a house right now? Do some sort of tax thing for you, right? What about you're pregnant and the corporation that's near you is polluting the air? Can your fetus file a lawsuit against that corporation in order to clean the air? No, not at all. The only area where we're saying that there's lawful recognition of childhood in a fetus state is vis-a-vis whether a woman can have an abortion.
Mm. Yeah, definitely more food for thought there. And I think a lot of the reproductive justice discourse focuses on individual liberty, which I think is good and it should and it must. Some critics argue that it underweights the duties and recognitions to families, to fathers, to communities, and I guess sometimes the term we hear about is social fabric. And that one I wonder about because I feel like that there is some valid there. Now, I don't think that should necessarily overrule the importance to individual liberty, but I do wonder when we consider families and fathers and communities, how should we consider these actors and these groups when it comes to this discussion?
It's a great question, and I'd like to blend it with the prior question as well a bit, which is that eh, the these areas deserve clarity and yet also deep nuance too. So to just end on the prior and to go into this is to also understand that there are individuals who want to be able to have healthy pregnancies and want to be able to give birth and to be able to rear their children with dignity. And that has to be a part of these conversations as well. So when we're asking about life beginning and whatnot, what we can talk about is healthy pregnancy. And I do think that one challenge, as there's the effort to sort out all of this, happens to be how do we support people who very much want to be able to become parents and want to be able to rear their children with dignity. And those are economic questions. And oftentimes, states that are states, nations, local governments that may take a what they would call an anti-abortion stance, or they would actually call it a pro-life stance, do very little in supporting the human dignity of those who are economically vulnerable, who want parenthood. And I think that the conversation has to include that as well. And one last layer to that, as I've been thinking about, given some of the challenges that are experienced with immigrant populations around the world or in the United States, with people that are not immigrant populations but have been, multiple generations, many, many generations in the nation, thinking about Black people, Black, brown people in the United States, is the ability to be able to see your child into childhood, into adulthood, without what are the terrible terrors of racism and bigotry, which can lead to significant harm. All right, this question with regard to uh, who else figures within the community of pregnancy. Well, our bodies do belong to ourselves,
Mhm.
and they do. um the the woman's cold, the woman's fever is not, is some, hopefully she has caregiving but with the people that are around her, but it's not their bodies that experience it. If she has uterine cancer, it's her body that's experiencing the uterine cancer. Cervical cancer, it's her body that is experiencing the breast cancer. It's her body that is undergoing that and experiencing it. The same is true with a man in prostate cancer. It is his body that experiences it. As much as mates may love each other and care about each other deeply, it is those individual bodies that are experiencing those medical harms and that will need the care that is provided by medical professionals. Now, that said, communities of love are very important. And here, too, I think that we could answer this question by thinking it through in the different kinds of lenses, right? There might be a religious lens where, because of a religious perspective that someone has, that is a pregnancy that is not alone to the woman. I don't agree with that perspective, but I am saying that that perspective can exist, right? By law, the body belongs to the woman. The pregnancy is to her body. If there is something that occurs in that pregnancy that is caused by her or relates to her, she is the person that is being responded to by the state with regard to that. Are there other ways of thinking these matters through? Well, there certainly are. In a society where we've taken criminal punishments out of this and where we've taken civil punishments out of this, then we are able to think in a much more flourishing way about what is healthy about a pregnancy and a birth, which would be great. We open ourselves to being able to think about how community is shaped. There are books that have been written about it takes a village to raise a child. Well, you know what? In the best case scenarios, that is actually true. It is. But again, there are legal silos to that as well. So philosophically, let's have our village. Let's have a warm embrace. Let's have relationships that sustain pregnancies. Let's have relationships that also support when pregnancy termination needs to take place. Let's also have community embrace when a miscarriage is taking place and there is the need for love, care, compassion. So it's not that community has no place within a space of pregnancy and childbirth, but there are limitations, and ultimately the legal issues where they need to be is to reside at the point of the person whose body is experiencing this.
And Michelle, I come from a law and a legal background. You obviously lecture at and are a professor at Georgetown Law. When the Roe versus Wade decision was reversed by the U.S. Supreme Court, I had a lot of conversations with people, and one of the things that sat with me, and I know I'm missing something here, so I want you to tell me what I'm missing. But when they returned abortion policy to the elected legislators at the state level, to me that looked like a democratic process, and I understand there's a lot more to it, and I want you to correct me. So when voters or elected representatives support abortion restrictions, and I recognize there's significant gerrymandering. We did an episode on that a couple of weeks ago on the podcast. But why should that be understood as democratic erosion? Why should that be seen as a travesty when that's why we have democracies? That's why we have our elected representatives, even if we disagree with the outcome. Can you talk to us about where that argument falls over?
Yes, well, we could spend a whole episode just on the architecture of the Dobbs decision as well. The Supreme Court overturning a right, something that the Supreme Court had not done before. The fact that there was a near 50-year precedent of the Roe decision, which then abolished criminal punishment for pregnancy termination. Let's talk really quickly about Dobbs and then what it meant politically. So, in this decision, the Supreme Court overturned not only Roe, but there had been many cases that the Supreme Court had actually heard, which reaffirmed Roe. So, one mistake is that even the Supreme Court treated the case as if there was one precedent that it was overturning, or maybe two: Planned Parenthood v. Casey, which was in the early 90s, and Roe v. Wade in the early 1970s. Not at all. The Supreme Court, over and over again in that period of time, had heard a number of cases, even just 3 years before the Dobbs decision. The Supreme Court, with the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court siding with the liberals, affirmed Roe v. Wade. So it was kind of like a coconut shell game. Let's not talk about the way in which over and over again we have found for this to be constitutional or legal. The Supreme Court didn't talk about in the decision how even at the time of Roe v. Wade, there was a case that was making its way to the Supreme Court. And it was a case that involved a woman who was in the military, Captain Kathy Struck, and she was not married, and she became pregnant. And the military, US military at the time, before Roe v. Wade, required that if you were pregnant in the military, you had to have an abortion. Can you imagine that? Yes. Ruth Bader Ginsburg spoke of this in her Supreme Court confirmation hearings. Yes, if you were serving in the US military, they didn't want women to be pregnant in the military. So if you're pregnant, you either have to leave or you have to have an abortion. She appealed her case 9 times. Each time she lost, saying, I want to stay pregnant. I want to stay pregnant. And this was the case when the young Ruth Bader Ginsburg was a lawyer. This was the case that she hoped the Supreme Court would take up, because if you are requiring that a woman must have an abortion, then this should mean that abortion should be decriminalized. And it should basically mean that women get to govern their own reproductive lives. Captain Kathy Struck ultimately has the pregnancy, gives the child up for adoption, but she lost all of those times that she was fighting the U.S. Military in order to be able to make these decisions on her own. There is an irony that comes out of the Dobbs decision. It is a case that hails out of the state of Mississippi. The Supreme Court overturned a lower court order which did not allow a Mississippi abortion ban to go into effect. The author of that decision was Judge Carlton Reeves, who happens to be a Black judge from the American South. And the order is powerful because in that order, at the time, states that were proposing abortion bans claimed that they were doing so to protect women's health and safety. They said, well, abortions are just so dangerous, and so we want to ban abortion because abortions are dangerous. So let me just stop there for your listeners. Abortions are far safer than pregnancy. What the Supreme Court, in fact, noted in 2016 in a case called Whole Women's Health v. Hellerstedt is that a woman is 14 times more likely to die carrying a pregnancy to term than by having an abortion. An abortion is as safe as a penicillin shot. Abortions are incredibly safe. They're much safer than pregnancy. So, what Judge Carlton Reeves said is, Mississippi, you're pulling our legs. In fact, he used the term gaslighting, which I had to look up. I was not so hip then. And so, what is this gaslighting? And he said, Mississippi, how can you tell us that this is about health and safety of women? You have one of the highest maternal mortality rates in the entire country and one of the highest in the world. You have an incredibly high maternal morbidity rate. How in the world is this about health and safety? How can you say that you have any claims towards women, their civil liberties and civil rights, when you denied women serving on juries? You denied women the right to vote. How in the world, Mississippi, when in fact you say that you're doing this because you want to protect Black women, when in fact you have a history of the Mississippi appendectomy, which was no appendectomy at all, but the coercive sterilizing of Black women? And basically was Mississippi, make it make sense, because it doesn't make sense. None of these arguments do. The Supreme Court didn't contend with any of what Judge Carlton Reeves laid out. And the Supreme Court said, well, we'll just send these issues back to the states. It's worth noting that in the United States, we talked before about the Civil War. The majority of the states that had these bans that they were ready to put in place were former Confederate states. And so you see this map. If you look at a map of the United States where there are abortion bans and high rates of maternal mortality and high rates of maternal morbidity, they look just like the pre Civil War map of the United States. Here are the Confederate states. And the last piece, because you asked about what this means politically, that just seems like democratic process. Well, how these issues tie together is that the Confederate states, which then became the Jim Crow and Jane Crow states of the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, banning Black people's ability to be able to vote, making it very coercive through poll tax. And let me just say again, in Mississippi, and it's a place where my maternal grandparents grew up and were born, they lived through American Jim Crow. What was American Jim Crow? It was not just that you can't sit where you want on a bus or on a train. It meant the denial of educational opportunities while you paid your taxes, the denial of the ability to go into your local park. Kids couldn't play in the park. Your kids couldn't swim in the local pool. Your kids couldn't go to the local billiard place. In laws that specifically target Black people may not go to billiards. That's Mississippi, right? That's the Dobbs state. That's the state that says, let's get rid of abortion, but we want to really protect Black women from themselves, right? This is a state where to be able to vote, Black people had to guess how many jelly beans on a jar. When you're going to register and you have a white person there who's the clerk for the local county, making Black people, if I'm going to give you this form for you to be able to fill out to be able to vote, tell me accurately how many jelly beans are in this jar behind me. All right. So, in that context, then we have to think about the Supreme Court saying, let's make this a democratic process. Go back to Mississippi and have your Mississippi lawmakers figure this out with your right to vote. Now, what does that mean in a space in which this Supreme Court, only a few years before the Dobbs decision, made a decision weakening the Voting Rights Act in the United States, which then ultimately resulted in the closing of polling places near Black neighborhoods and the policing and the surveillance then of the polling places where Black people do go? So now tell Black women, in light of all of that history of Mississippi, past and present, go vote. In a space where the Mississippi legislature that passed its abortion ban was over 86% male, overwhelmingly white, and without even having women chairing major committees. That Mississippi. And if I could add just one additional piece to this, just the day before the Dobbs decision was announced, the Supreme Court announced a different decision, a decision by the name of Bruin. And this was a case that involved gun rights. And Justice Thomas wrote the opinion for the court. And what was being challenged was a centuries old gun law in the United States to protect public health and safety. It didn't say that there may be no guns in the United States, but there were regulations that were associated with it. It was more than a centuries old. And here is the irony. In the Bruin decision, the day before Dobbs, Justice Thomas says, and this is incredibly rare, you know, with a legal background, that this is rare. He says that a prologue is necessary. You don't see prologues in Supreme Court cases. He said prologue is necessary, such that we understand what is at risk here if New York is able to keep its gun law. And what is at risk is Black male bodily autonomy. And you cannot make that up. And he spends 5 paragraphs talking about the importance of Black male bodily autonomy and how Black male bodily autonomy is connected with Black men and their ability to be able to have access to firearms. And then he gives examples rooted in slavery, rooted in Jim Crow. He talks about, here is this case of a Black male professor. Here is the case of a Black male music teacher, and so forth. And that very next day, in a case that comes out of Mississippi, a state that was known for its horrors of lynching during Jim Crow, sexual abuse during slavery, there is not one mention of Black women and bodily autonomy. Not at all by Justice Thomas or the majority of the Supreme Court.
That's yeah, very, very difficult to follow any of that up, Michelle. I might just ask the last question in the last 30 seconds, Michelle. I mean, thank you so much for all the insight on the Supreme Court's decisions and the background. They're incredibly interesting. But one question we ask all guests on the International Risk podcast is, when you look around the world, there's so much happening. I mean, there's so much happening just in America, but when you look all around the world, what are the risks that concern you the most?
The failure to care for the peace of others and the human dignity of others, the failure to embrace our neighbors as our own, the failure to understand their children as deserving lives of flourishing, our inability to see and show human compassion towards other people who are vulnerable. It's that which I think we need to address. And it is our failure to address that is and will undermine the future of people all around the world.
Fantastic. Well, look, Professor Michele Goodwin of Georgetown Law, thank you very much for coming on the International West podcast today. And for our listeners, you don't have to like or agree with everything we discussed, but the important part of knowledge is hearing everyone's different opinions and being able to weigh them up. So thank you so much for coming on the podcast and helping us understand this, Michelle.
Thank you.
Well, that was Professor Michele Goodwin of Georgetown Law. She's an acclaimed bioethicist, a constitutional law scholar, and an acclaimed author as well. What a fantastic conversation today. Thanks very much for listening to the International Risk podcast. I'm your host, Dominic Bowen. I look forward to speaking with you again in the next couple of days.